Happy Sunday, everyone. Let's talk leadership roulette. Now, what does it mean? This term is used by people to refer to an inconsistency from one leader to the next, right? A disparate outcome for similarly situated individuals. And if there's 31,000 plus wards and branches, that means there's 31,000 plus individual leaders who have opinions and biases. They're swapped out every 5 years, so you have this constantly new wave of new leaders without experience. This doesn't apply, of course, just to wards and branches. It could apply to things like missions, things that could get you a compassionate hug and a listening ear from one mission president could get you sent home by another. And leadership roulette ultimately is a consequence of systems, not so much people. So what I'm about to share and what we'll go through isn't so much a criticism of the people involved, who are often reluctant individuals called to be a bishop or a leader or whatever. Oftentimes they're reluctant. They don't want to be in that position. Yes, they're fallible, etc. Otherwise, well-meaning people, well-intended. It's not so much a criticism of the people as much as it is a criticism of how the system is structured. So towards the end, I'll offer some, from my vantage point, improvements or tweaks that could be made to this system to minimize leadership roulette. And then I'm curious to hear in the comments what you guys think, if you see an opportunity to address this issue, or even if it's an issue. Now, why do we call it leadership roulette? Well, the term, as I understand it, originates from Russian roulette, which is a potentially lethal game in which a person puts a single round into a revolver, and they spin the cylinder and they place the gun against their head or another person's head and then pull the trigger, right? So you've got a chance, low chance, but still a chance nonetheless of dying. That's Russian roulette. So here we get leadership roulette. You've got a chance of having a harsh experience with a leader. You've got a chance of having a hardline bishop who's going to treat you, much differently than another bishop might, or that you might get that treatment in another ward with a different bishop. So where does this manifest? Leadership roulette comes up in a number of areas. I've shared on the past musing before how our current bishop was told by the previous, at the time, stake president to shave his beard, right? You get some of these stake presidents who call or appoint bishops or call them and have these like cultural things that they hang on to. So it could be something as simple as, facial hair and whether you're enforcing that on others, and white shirts and kind of cultural expectations about dress and grooming. LGBT, right? I did a musing, a year ago or so about this guy convert who thinks he's a trans woman and claims that he was put on the records of the church by his bishopric and the ward clerk as a woman, and claims he's a woman. And, there you've got a disparate outcome relative to what might happen to that individual or how that individual would be considered and treated by a different bishop in a different ward. You have church leaders withdrawing membership from some Latter-day Saints in same-sex marriages, but not all. You have some bishops who are very accommodating and very open of that, inviting and not going so far as to withdraw membership. So vastly different outcomes for people in same-sex marriages. Proposition 2 in Utah, I've shared before my own experience where people were calling my church leaders apparently to try and rat me out because I had taken an opposing stance to the church on the issue of medical cannabis in Utah, the campaign I was leading. And it was only later that my bishop told me, and my bishop is now my stake president, that at the time he was getting, I think, emails from people who had tracked him down online, tracked down where I live, tracked down who the bishop of that area is. They figure it out, they email him, and they say, oh, O'Connor, is doing these horrible things, and you should, punish him or whatever. And so he, like a year or two afterwards, told me that he had gotten these emails. I didn't know at the time. And he went to the stake president and said, what should I do about this? And the stake president said, just leave it alone. I had an awesome stake president then. I do now. I have a great bishop. But someone in my position, taking a different public political stance against the church had publicly come out in a press conference, in statements to the press, right? In an email to every member of the church in Utah, saying Proposition 2 is bad, don't vote for it, etc. They had released a legal memo attacking Proposition 2. What did I do? I wrote a counter argument, an opposing legal memo, picking apart their legal memos from Kurt McConkie, but as the church, showing how ridiculous the legal memo was. And I was giving statements to the press, and we were doing our own press conferences, pushing back and fighting for it. So in another ward, in another location with a different bishop, I could have been punished. I could have had my records removed. I could have been subjected to a disciplinary council. I wasn't, thankfully, but luck of the draw. That's the roulette right there. COVID response, another example, how leaders of the church responded to COVID-19 in terms of enforcing masking in church or social distancing. This was more almost area authority roulette, because you'd have different kind of top-down directives for how things are going to be handled, and then the stake presidents would go kind of pass that on, and bishops would enforce it. And so you get leadership roulette in terms of how that was managed. Mission presidents, you can get vastly different responses. I mentioned before kind of the compassionate hug versus the stern, you're out of here. I had 2 mission presidents, one finished while I was still on my mission, and then we got another one. And the first one was chill. I was an office elder for, 11 months or longer. And we were tasked with figuring out what movie to watch for the Christmas, I think it was the Christmas party. And so the mission president said, hey, go get some Disney or some rated, G or PG movies, watch a few of them and figure out what you think the missionaries would like. And so every night for 2 weeks, we would have a movie night in the office to watch a movie and to, make the selection. And he was really chill. He was like, oh, okay, listen to music if it's instrumental, and even then he didn't really care. He wasn't really a hardliner about that kind of stuff. Next mission president comes in and he's more of a, hardliner. And so you can get vastly different responses in missions about conduct or things that might get you punished or disciplined or sent home even by one mission president versus another. You get some members who go in for their temple recommend interview and they might admit or share that they drink the occasional cup of coffee or something. And you get some leaders who are like, yeah, okay, no big deal. That shouldn't keep you out of the making covenants to get to the celestial kingdom. And you've got other leaders who are going to very strictly enforce the word of wisdom's kind of pharisaical aspects against denying someone entrance into God's house. Bishop youth interviews. Some will do very probing interviews. Others will not. Keep it kind of high level and vague and discretionary and so forth. I've heard of some leaders who will allow members of the church who have a concealed carry permit or whatever to be armed in the church in contradiction to the church policies about that. And then others, of course, who would enforce the church's position of not having handguns, but instead to throw a hymnal or something at an attacker if you can't flee or evade. Being a thinking, questioning type of person, my disposition to be willing to challenge assumptions and cultural traditions, administrative decisions, policies by church leaders who in our culture are generally upheld as the prophet, therefore don't question. My nature is to kind of have open, frank discussions and not be unwilling to poke at some of these things that might be uncomfortable. Well, again, like with the Prop 2 thing, I could be charged with apostasy for, teaching various things that I don't think that Section 132 is from God, that I think polygamy was created by Brigham and others and foisted on Joseph, inappropriately, that I have a different interpretation of tithing. I think the original interpretation is quite different than what's being unreasonably enforced on church members. Not enforced because you're able to say what you think, whether you're a full tithe payer, but the perception and the teaching about, 10% of income, I think is wrong. The word of wisdom, I could go through the list. Frankly, you could just go to sundaymusings.org and scroll down and find your own, right, of things that I've said or suggested or that I believe that kind of run afoul to the majoritarian, conventional wisdom or teaching of the church. I've disagreed publicly on this podcast with church leaders, right? I've highlighted different quotes that have been made, things that have been taught, even over the pulpit and general conference, and I've kind of had differing takes or approaches, or I've shown on the one hand this was said, and then I've shared another church leader saying something different, and I've highlighted this incongruity and potential confusion. So I'm not unwilling to see the fallibility of these church leaders and therefore question some of their decisions and their actions, and be willing to entertain the fact that maybe this isn't from, certain things aren't from God. Well, I mean, again, thankfully I have a very great bishop and great stake president, awesome guys. I don't think I'll ever have, this problem with them, but I could get a hardliner bishop, or if we ever moved or they changed the bishop or whatever, again, it's that roulette. I happen to get lucky. I mean, I field a question about this maybe once a month from people who listen to the podcast, people who comment, on Facebook or whatever, and they'll be like, man, I would have, my bishop would have excommunicated me by now for saying some of the things that you have. And that's another example of leadership roulette. Even things like ward budget decisions, whether the Relief Society should get more money than the Elders Quorum, or which callings to give, whether to make a disciplinary action, a variety of things can be subject to this leadership roulette. Okay, so now a few different thoughts, and then we will get into some potential improvements to the system in order to reduce leadership roulette. Now, we want leaders of the church to be discerning and follow the Spirit. All 31,000 plus of them, and then more, because you got stake presidents and area authorities and general authorities and all the rest, right? Tens of thousands of people who are in a leadership position in the church, not to say Elders Quorum and Relief Society and other smaller leadership positions. We want them to follow the Spirit. We want them to use discernment in the decisions that they make. But do they? Do all of them? Right? It has to be that some percentage, wherever you want to place that line, some percentage of people in these positions are not going to seek the Spirit, or are going to not have the Spirit, or are going to have personal behavior that doesn't allow for the Spirit to guide them, and on and on and on. So there's some percentage, I don't know what number to put to that, who do not have the Spirit, who are not discerning, which leads to section 121. We all know this scripture, but I think it has some relevancy here when we talk about even the leaders of the church. Verse 39, we have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition of almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. Now note that what Joseph was saying here is the nature and disposition of almost all men. He did not say almost all non-Mormon men, or almost all men who aren't in leadership positions, or have a certain calling, or anything like that. The nature and disposition of almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they'll immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. I think that's quite interesting to reflect on. How does that pertain to even leaders of the church and the authority that they suppose that they've received, whether they're going to exercise potentially unrighteous dominion? Now, when we think of a bad bishop or a hardline bishop or someone like that, I think oftentimes there's ignorance at play. Maybe they're incompetent, though overconfident in their, gospel knowledge and their leadership style and so forth. They're out of their depth. They're overwhelmed. Rather than having disdain for these people, you can almost have a level of compassion and pity that, again, these are volunteer people who probably would rather be spending their Sundays not having one meeting after another in the church. And so even the bad bishops, I mean, clearly there's like some small percentage of like malicious or horribly abusive situations. I'm not talking about that. But generally speaking, I think there's just a lot of overwhelm and a lot of potential ignorance about how to handle certain things. The challenge for me in all of this becomes when eternal salvation hinges on roulette. Again, using myself as an example, I'm kind of safe right now, I guess you could say, or at least that's my assumption, that I'm not going to get called in anytime soon to repent and be disciplined or whatever for any of the stuff that I've shared and that I believe. But that could be very different, as I said. So my eternal salvation, my membership in the church, my covenants, all of these things are predicated on this game of roulette, and the chance of potential disciplinary encounters with a church leader who may or may not be kind of this hardline, type of leader. The stakes are high, right? This isn't just like the administration of some business regulation or the city allowing you to paint your fence a certain color, right? We're talking about eternal stakes. Now, what I find interesting to think about is D&C 88, where it says that God's house is a house of order. And so presumably having order, as like thinking of my own home and my own family, to create order, there are certain rules to follow. There's, you might say, bureaucracy. There are leadership hierarchies. There are clear rules to follow. And, bishops deciding situations very differently, you might say, is out of order. If a same-sex married couple of two church members is in Ward A and Ward B, and Ward A withdraws membership, I guess we don't say excommunication anymore. So membership was withdrawn from the couple in Ward A, but in Ward B, they're allowed to remain members of the church. That creates very disparate outcomes. That does not seem like having a house of order. So presumably then that suggests disempowering local leaders so that there is more, I'll call it rigidity and clear outcomes and decisions to remove the discretion from the local leaders. Otherwise, you get these very varying experiences, which in my mind raises some significant red flags. So, the antidote, what is the antidote? A rigid handbook with even more specificity? You look at the For the Strength of Youth pamphlet. I did a musing on that a year or whenever ago when they released the new one. And what before was a little rigid has kind of moved in a come follow me direction, focusing on broader principles and creating more personal empowerment and discretion. So I don't know that they go in this direction, but a rigid handbook, more rules, could create more order and reduce some of these disparate outcomes. And so the judges in Israel would almost less become the bishops themselves, but move up to like higher levels of administration if the bishops no longer have kind of the discernment to have these totally different outcomes. So perhaps you need a mix between order on the one hand and flexibility on the other, which leads to some potential improvements. Now, I offer these just as speculative potential ideas to chew on, not, the church must do this, and this is my campaign, and I'm on this quest. It's just as I've been reflecting about this topic and my own situation, like, okay, for someone like me, what would minimize the chances of having to play roulette? What would kind of smooth things out so that you're not at the mercy of whoever happens to get called and what their position is? So here follow a few potential improvements that might help, might being the key word. So the first one I thought of is more vetting before calling someone to be, let's say, a bishop. Like a personality test, there are many that can help weed out the kind of people who are attracted to positions of power and authority. If, as Joseph Smith said, almost all men will abuse their authority, then let's mitigate against that. If that, in fact, is like a true trend of our human nature and the carnal man, let's try and mitigate against that. Relying on inspiration alone isn't sufficient, because plenty of people are called, but then abuse their authority and create all these problems, right? Not all 31,000 bishops are just, peachy keen and doing great. And so you can't rely only on inspiration. You need to study it out in your heart and your mind. We need to do the work, perhaps, to vet a little more. So maybe there could be some type of, personality test or dynamic to weed out the people who want the authority, right? Because the very people who want authority are the ones who should least have it. The ones who have ambition and kind of authoritarian tendencies and want to micromanage and so forth, right? Those are the people that you don't want to give the keys of the kingdom to. So maybe there can be a way to vet that a little more and weed some of those people out. Number two is more training for newly called bishops. So, back when we were doing the scouting program and someone was called as a scoutmaster, for example, they were expected to take a week of vacation off of work and go to Wood Badge, which is the adult leader training. So there's this expectation that, hey, you're managing this program, you're working with the boys, you need to go get trained on how to do your job. 1 week of training. And yet there's no, as I understand it, any codified training offered or mandated for newly called bishops. Kind of interesting when you think about, especially the conversations they're having, the the so-called power they wield, the situations they're in, and so forth. You would think that by contrast, if wood badge was being required of these people, then maybe we need some different training for bishops. Now, that alone is probably insufficient. It's difficult, very difficult probably to train the core aspects of spiritual leadership, right? Things like having wisdom, having people skills, being compassionate, seeing the other person's perspective. It's not like you can just go through a PowerPoint slide deck by someone for 45 minutes and be like, okay, I now am trained as a bishop, right? So probably insufficient. And think of actual judges, not in Israel, but in a court of law. These are judges who get tons of training on the law, on court rule, and yet there's still judge roulette. I mean, lawyers know, oh, that judge is going to be better for that type of motion, or if I have a client like this, that's the better judge to be in front of. You still get roulette, even though there's lots of training in those types of systems. But what does that system have that ours does not? That leads to the third idea for improvement that I came up with or thought of, and that is a more robust appeals process, right? In a court of law, there's a very clear opportunity for appeals, and ours is, I'll call it a little murky, if not non-existent in some of these cases. And so if we honored the right of a member of the church to have their grievance heard, that could reduce the effects of losing bishop roulette if there's a chance for appeal. You know, right now, people with a bad experience, they might uproot their family and move in search of a better bishop. That's crazy to have to take that extreme of an action to try and get away from the hardline bishop and find someone more like compassionate or whatever. You know, why should someone's eternal outcome be predicated on their place of residence and the roulette of what leader happens to be there? Now, there's some problems with an appeal, with this being an idea for improvement. There's some problems with it. If you can appeal the unfair choice of a bishop, let's say to not issue a temple recommend to someone based on them drinking coffee, right, or whatever the topic might be, couldn't you also appeal more mundane type of decisions, you know, like someone being called to a position or the Relief Society, you know, getting approval for this type of activity? How do you draw the line around what is appealable? That to me would be a question mark. And then how would a formalized appellate process be any functionally different than what members do now, which is, you know, if there's a problematic decision, they'll just go directly to the stake president and kind of alert him. So it's not formal. It's not like there's a hearing to be held and the person offers testimony or whatever. It's just, hey, I'm going to go alert the stake president, who has the discretion to do or not do something about it. And I think ultimately the stake president is likely going to defer to local decisions, as would area authorities, right? Hey, no, we called this person. I feel like I was inspired when I called them. They must know something I don't. I lack all the information. I'm going to defer to them. So even if you had an appellate process, I don't know that it would substantively change very much if the leaders at the top are going to just kind of defer to the local leaders and not really overrule. Okay, so number 4 is that bishops who go out of line, whatever that means, should be removed from their position and corrective action should be taken. Now, this happens from time to time. It's not like this has never happened, but I don't know that there's any type of like formal process. What am I trying to say? Perhaps this might need to be done more than it is ultimately what I'm trying to say. Because if you don't weed out the bad apples, then you spoil the bunch. But I think there's a reluctance by church leadership at the general level to weed out those who cause problems. They might want to not undermine the confidence and the faith of church members. And so if we yank this, bishop out, then that could cause problems. Removing a bishop or a leader of the church could be the consequence of a successful appeal if there was an appellate process, right? There has to be accountability. Just recently, Trump and Biden were debating, and Trump rightly pointed out that Biden had not fired anybody, like in the butchered withdrawal from Afghanistan or with COVID, and all these problems. If no one's held accountable, then behavior is not corrected. But within the church hierarchy, I suspect that there's little ability to deal with a bishop who has kind of gone rogue or is overly punitive or who holds extreme views. They're called by stake presidents who generally are going to support the people that they called. And if you escalate concerns through the priesthood hierarchy, then, that means either you're being ignored perhaps, or your complaint is sent back down to the very leader who you're trying to appeal from, which isn't really ideal. And how often does the church take the side of a complainant against the bishop? I mean, if there's a legal aspect to this or a PR aspect to this, sometimes that's going to create the pressure necessary to override some of these tendencies to leave it alone and to defer to the local leaders of the church. So if people ramp things up through legal or media pressure, then that can sometimes create change, but they shouldn't have to do that. And so how do we overcome those internal resistance to be unwilling to challenge and review honestly and sincerely the appealed action of the local leader? Okay, so to address this, we go to number 5. Perhaps we could have some type of like ombudsman. You know, I work in politics all throughout the government. There's these ombudsman, office of inspector general, these positions where people's job is to review and supervise and make sure the law is being followed and make sure, you know, grievances are heard, investigating, rooting out waste and abuse, mismanagement. The church bureaucracy probably would not want a position like this, but this could be interesting, right? If there was a position where you could go file these appeals and there was someone or someone's whose job it would be to go and investigate and bring back evidence to leaders of the church and say, this is a case, you know, where we need to intervene, rather than going through the priesthood hierarchy and to the stake president who has kind of a close relationship with the, you know, in a traditional, like if you're in a court of law and you're appealing something or you're being heard by a judge, if that judge has a relationship with the prosecutor in the case, or if the judge, as an attorney in years past, worked on a case on that issue, what do? They recuse themselves, right? You're trying to get like an impartial person heard. But when you go up the chain and you're reporting a bishop to a stake president, then you kind of have these conflicts. And so maybe an ombudsman or an office of inspector general type of independent position that could field complaints and inquiries and then investigate might be more suited to identifying if there are problems that need to be addressed, more training offered, or something of the like, right? Again, I think that the church bureaucracy doesn't really want to smack down, you know, these leaders who they believe through their infrastructure and process have all been called of God. They don't want to undermine the faith of members. They don't want to unnecessarily, you know, call into question a bishop's decision and so forth. But that might create a power imbalance that allows for the abuse of authority that Joseph Smith was talking about. So maybe we can mitigate against that. The final idea for improvement was consolidation. So if you, of wards and branches, I mean, if you've got a branch with under 100 people in it, you're struggling with callings, right? You're not getting the greatest pianist to play. You're perhaps not getting the greatest branch president. Maybe the 5 other people that were asked were said no, which is not uncommon to have people decline callings, right? Maybe the Relief Society isn't the greatest at compassion service, or they're overworked like crazy because there's so many needs and not really a lot of infrastructure and people to support. So why call a bad leader or kind of the bottom of the barrel type of situation when a talented bishop or branch president nearby, if you consolidated, could accommodate a larger congregation and have you'd have a better leader in that position rather than relying on these smaller units and congregations. So you're increasing the pool of qualified candidates who could handle a larger congregation. I think of remote work, right? The fact that I don't need someone to be sitting in a chair in our office 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. I open up the pool of candidates. I can find greater talent if I can now search across the country and be like, you don't have to move here. You can work wherever. I've got way more options now, and I can increase the quality of candidates. Maybe the same, too, if we expanded the size of congregations, especially for the smaller ones, to create a larger pool of candidates for leaders of the church. And then any particular bad leader, any idiot or whatever is you know, their impact is reduced because you have far more normal people. All right, in conclusion, whether those improvements are a good idea, you let me know in the comments. Maybe you have other ideas. Maybe, you know, there's nothing to be done about this at all, and it just is what it is. But in a system where there exists a certain level of discretion, you're going to have a roulette problem. There will be disparate outcomes when you let humans use discretion to decide things that might vary from other people in similarly situated circumstances. And so decision-making roulette isn't really a Mormon phenomenon. As I pointed out, in courts of law, judges and attorneys have the same dynamic, right? And so in every system in which humans get to make decisions, think of ratemyprofessor.com. You can go kind of pick your professor and identify, oh, everyone says this guy's easier, that one's harder, this one's better, right? And you can make those choices and have those different outcomes. So I don't think this is a church issue. I think this is just a human nature issue. In our case, with leadership roulette, it's in a Mormon context, but really this is just a problem with human beings and the systems that are designed to help manage their interactions. So I think it's system design, and I think our system could use a little bit of tweaking. It's not a perfect system necessarily. Therefore, I think there are ways to mitigate some of the impact of what Joseph Smith talked about with the abuse of almost all people, all men when they get authority, and the very clear experiences of many Latter-day Saints who have some type of outcome, who, if they had a different leader of the church, they would have a different outcome. That can rub you the wrong way when you're kicked out of the church, or when you're disciplined, or when you're removed from a calling, or some type of action is taken when you just lost the game of roulette. And had circumstances been different, had you moved somewhere else, had you, someone else been called, had you waited 2 more years until there was a new bishop who wouldn't take an action like that, that just creates a lot of variables. And when the stakes are high, them being eternal stakes, it really seems that we should make sure the system is designed in a way to mitigate, insofar as humanly possible, the opportunity for roulette to create disparate outcomes as it pertains to people's eternal salvation. Let me know in the comments what you think. If you're listening to the audio, you can go over and leave a comment on the YouTube page. Thank you, as always, for listening, for sharing this with others. SundayMusings.org is where you can find other musings if you're new to this or just catching up. There's a whole lot of topics. You can search by topic and filter it down and see if we talked about something else that interests you. Appreciate you guys all for listening, and I'll see you next Sunday.